The dust had not yet settled on the auction platform when Rose Shelton realized that every man in Caldwell, Kansas had already decided what she was worth before she ever opened her mouth. It was the autumn of 1878, and the sky over Caldwell stretched wide and merciless, the color of old bone, swept clean by a wind that carried the smell of cattle and dry earth and the faint chemical tang of the nearby tannery. The town sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a coin dropped at a crossroads, and it wore that position with the proud, rough energy of a place that knew it mattered. Saloons lined the main street shoulder to shoulder with general stores and livery stables, and the wooden boardwalks were crowded that Saturday morning with cowboys, ranchers, merchants, and idlers who had nothing better to do than watch other people's business unfold. Rose had not come to Caldwell to be auctioned. She needed that to be understood, even if only by herself, even if no one else would ever hear the clarification. She had come to settle her late father's debts, and those debts had a way of turning a woman into property before she had taken 3 full breaths of consideration. Her father, Clement Shelton, had died 6 weeks prior from a fever that moved through him with the same indifferent efficiency as a grass fire through dry prairie. He had left behind a small homestead plot 3 miles east of town, a mule named Absalom who was half-blind and entirely stubborn, $37 in a tin box buried under the kitchen floor, and a debt of $212 owed to a man named Gerald Holt, who operated the largest grain and supply company in Sumner County, and who had the reputation of a man who smiled at funerals. Gerald Holt had shown up at the homestead 4 days after her father was in the ground. He had stood in the doorway of the small cabin in his brown suit and his polished shoes, and he had explained to Rose, with the patient tone of a schoolteacher addressing a slow child, that the debt was due and that her father's land was not worth what he owed and that there were other means of settling accounts. He had looked at her the way men look at livestock. He had already done the arithmetic. The auction had been his idea. A work auction, he called it, a practical solution. A woman of Rose Shelton's particular skills, she could cook, sew, keep books, manage a household, ride a horse without embarrassment, could bring in a fair price for a year's labor contract, and that contract price would go directly toward the debt, and Gerald Holt would forgive the remainder out of his own particular generosity, which was the kind of generosity that always came attached to something. Rose was 24 years old. She was not a fool. She had read enough of her father's books, and enough of the newspapers that came through Caldwell, to understand that this arrangement sat in a gray territory that decent people did not like to examine too closely. Labor contracts were not slavery, they were not, but they were not nothing either, and the fact that Gerald Holt stood to benefit from the transaction in ways that extended well beyond the recovery of a financial debt was visible in the way he smiled when he described the arrangement. She had no real choice. The lawyer in town, a thin man named Patterson, had confirmed as much. The debt was real. The land was insufficient collateral. She had no family left within 500 miles. She could refuse and lose the homestead entirely and find herself destitute in a cattle town, or she could submit to the auction and work out the debt and retain whatever remained of the land when it was done. She stood on the wooden platform that had been erected in front of the town hall. There were 14 men gathered in the dusty square below her, and she had decided, in the minutes before the auctioneer called for order, that she would look at none of them. She would look at the far edge of town, where the open prairie began, and she would think about something else entirely. She would think about the way her father used to read to her from the Bible, not as religion, but as literature, and the sound of his voice, and the way the lamplight made the walls of the cabin golden in the evenings. The auctioneer was a man named Briggs, who also sold horses on the second Saturday of every month and who brought the same businesslike energy to both endeavors. He cleared his throat and explained the terms. 1 year of labor, domestic service, comprehensive household skills, starting bid of $50. Rose kept her eyes on the horizon. The bidding began. She heard voices below her, numbers rising in small increments, the way men bid when they are interested but not committed. $60, 70. A voice she recognized as belonging to one of the ranchers from south of town, a man named Bridle who had 3 grown sons and a wife who had stopped speaking voluntarily sometime around 1872. $80. She did not look at any of them. Then she felt it. Not heard, not seen. Felt. The particular quality of attention that differentiates being watched from being seen. It moved across the space between her and whoever stood below like something warm, and it was so unlike everything else in that cold, appraising morning that it made her breath catch in the exact center of her chest. She looked down. He was standing slightly apart from the other men, the way a person stands when they are not entirely sure they belong in a crowd but have decided to be there anyway. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a working man's hands that hung loose at his sides. He wore a plain gray coat that had seen considerable use, and a dark hat with the brim pushed back from his face. He was perhaps 28 or 29, not young exactly but not weathered into middle age either, still carrying the lean certainty of a man who had not yet run up hard against the particular wall that eventually humbles everyone. But it was his face that stopped her. He was not smiling. He was not assessing. He was not doing what every other man in that square was doing, which was looking at her the way a person looks at something they might purchase. He was looking at her the way you look at someone when you want them to know you see them. His eyes were steady and gray-green and entirely direct, and they met hers without flinching or deflecting, and in them was an expression she could not immediately name, something that was one part steadiness and one part something quieter and more complicated, something like recognition or maybe like regret on someone else's behalf. She held that gaze for 4 full seconds. She counted later, and it was 4 seconds. Then he raised his hand. $120, he said, and his voice was calm and unhurried, and the number was $30 higher than the previous bid, and it silenced the square for a moment in a way that was almost like punctuation. His name, as she would learn it that same afternoon, was Warren Weston. The auction ended 3 minutes later when the man named Bridle countered at $130, and Warren Weston, without any particular display of drama, raised his hand again and said $175, and nobody had an appetite for bidding against that kind of deliberateness. Gerald Holt collected the contract documents with a look on his face that told Rose the outcome had not been precisely what he had intended, though the money was the money, and he could not argue with it. Warren Weston signed the contract with a steady hand and folded his copy into the inside pocket of his gray coat without reading it over a second time, as if he already knew what was in it and was satisfied. Rose stepped down from the platform and stood in the dust of the square and looked at the man who had just bought a year of her life, and she said, before she could stop herself, "You looked at me before you bid. Why did you do that?" He turned his hat in his hands. "Because it seemed like the right thing to do," he said. She did not know what to say to that, and she was not a woman who often found herself without a response, so she simply looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said, "Where is it that you need me to go?" He had a ranch. A serious ranch, as it turned out, not a great sprawling cattle empire but a working property of 320 acres about 9 miles northwest of Caldwell, with a respectable herd of cattle and a sturdy stone and timber house that had been built by a man who intended to stay. His name was known in that part of the county as belonging to a man who was fair with his hands, fair with his neighbors, and not inclined toward the particular social performances that consumed so much of frontier life. He had a small hired crew. An older man named Dutch Ferris who had been punching cattle since before the war, and who moved with the permanently bowed legs of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than on foot. A younger hand named Caleb, 19 years old and from somewhere in Missouri, and eager in the way that young men are eager before the work makes them, something more measured. and a part-time cook and housekeeper named Mrs. Elba Marsh, a widow of 52 who came out 3 days a week from her home in town, and who had, according to Dutch, opinions about everything and the moral authority to express them. Mrs. Marsh's 3-day schedule was the reason Warren Weston had attended the auction in the first place. She had told him 2 weeks prior that her knees were past the work of keeping a full ranch house, and that he needed someone younger and more permanent, and that she would help him train whoever he found, but that he ought to find someone quickly because she intended to retire her full duties by winter. He had not advertised. He had not been looking. He had heard about the auction from Dutch Ferris, who had heard about it from someone in town, and he had gone not entirely sure of his intentions, only knowing that a woman being auctioned off in the town square in 1878 was something that could go in a very wrong direction depending on who was doing the bidding. He told her all of this during the 9-mile wagon ride to the ranch, not in a rush or with any particular agenda, simply talking the way a person talks when silence seems inadequate to the occasion. The sky was enormous above them, and the prairie grass moved in long, slow waves, and somewhere to the west, a hawk was making long circles in the afternoon air. Rose listened and said very little. She was recalibrating everything she had assumed about the situation and about this man, and she needed the ride to do it in. She had prepared herself for something grim, and she was finding instead something that was at least comprehensible and possibly decent, and she did not quite trust the relief that was settling tentatively in her chest, because she had learned that relief and disappointment often traveled together. "The work," she said, when he had finished explaining. "What exactly do you need?" "Same as any ranch house," he said. "Cooking, cleaning, the kitchen garden, some bookkeeping when the season requires it. Mrs. Marsh will show you the particulars. You'll have your own room, the small one off the kitchen, and Sunday afternoons are yours to do with as you like. I run a straightforward operation." She looked at him sideways. The sun was low enough now that it lit the side of his face in a way that was almost theatrical, and she could see the line of his jaw and the way his hands held the reins, easy and competent. He was a straightforward-looking man in all the ways that mattered. "The contract is for a year," she said. "Yes." "And at the end of it?" "At the end of it you're free to go wherever you intend to go, and the debt to Holt is cleared, and whatever's left of your father's land is yours outright. Patterson is handling the paperwork." She turned that over in her mind. "You paid $37 more than anyone else was willing to bid," she said. "I know." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled over a shallow rut and both of them steadied themselves. "Because I didn't like the look of the men who were bidding before me," he said, and his voice was measured in the way of a man who says exactly what he means and nothing extra. "And because I have the money and they were the ones with more interest than money, and that combination didn't sit right." Rose looked at him a while longer, this time without subtlety, because she wanted to read him clearly, and she had learned that you needed to look at someone straight on to do it. What she found was a man who appeared to mean what he said, which was not something she encountered frequently, and which she consequently did not entirely trust yet but was willing to consider. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and clucked to the horses, and the wagon moved on through the golden Kansas afternoon. The ranch was called the Weston place by everyone in the county, for lack of a more poetic name, and it sat against a long, low rise of land that broke the relentless flatness of the prairie in a way that gave the house a sense of being settled into the earth rather than simply placed on top of it. The stone house was larger than she had expected, with a proper kitchen and a sitting room with a fireplace and 3 bedrooms upstairs and the small room off the kitchen that would be hers. There was a real barn, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden that had gone somewhat to seed in the late autumn but showed evidence of having been properly tended through the summer. Mrs. Elba Marsh was waiting in the kitchen when they arrived. She was exactly as Dutch had described, a compact, weathered woman with sharp brown eyes and the bearing of someone who had survived considerable difficulty without letting it make her mean. She looked at Rose with the frank, measuring gaze of a woman assessing a replacement, and apparently found what she saw acceptable because, within 20 minutes, she had Rose seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and was explaining the running of the kitchen with the focused efficiency of a general briefing a new commander. Rose absorbed it all. She was good at absorbing information, and she was good at work, both of which her father had spent considerable effort ensuring, because he had been a man who believed that a woman ought to be able to stand on her own feet, and who had the decency to act on that belief even when it made him unusual among his neighbors. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the pantry, repaired 3 of the chicken coop's loose boards, completed a full inventory of the winter supplies and identified where the shortages would fall, started a new ledger for the ranch accounts because the existing one was a chaos of scratched-out figures and margin notes, and established a kitchen routine that produced meals at reliable times from whatever was available. Dutch Ferris watched all of this with the appreciation of a man who had been eating indifferent food at unpredictable hours for too long. Caleb watched with the open admiration of a 19-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise his enthusiasm. Mrs. Marsh, who came out twice in that first week to finish the handover, watched with professional satisfaction. Warren Weston watched with something she could not quite identify, but she caught him watching several times and he did not look away when she caught him, which she found interesting. He was not a man who was accustomed to having a woman in the house. That was visible in 100 small ways, in the way he paused at the kitchen door before entering, in the way he said thank you for meals with a slight excess of formality, as though he was remembering to do it rather than doing it naturally. He had been alone on this ranch for 3 years, since he had bought it from a man heading back east after one hard winter too many, and the solitude had shaped him in the way that solitude shapes people who are already inclined toward the interior, not lonely exactly, but accustomed to his own company in a way that other people's presence required some adjustment. Rose noticed all of this and found it more endearing than she expected to. They began talking in earnest on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October, when the temperature had dropped sharply and the first suggestion of winter was in the air. She had been working on the ranch accounts at the kitchen table after dinner, and he had come in from checking on the cattle and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her instead of taking his coffee to the sitting room as he usually did. She looked up. "How bad is it?" he asked, nodding at the ledger. "The accounts." She set down her pencil. "They're manageable. You're not in debt to anyone, which puts you well ahead of most ranches in this county. But your winter supply estimates are low for a hard winter, and if the price of cattle drops the way the newspapers are suggesting it might, you'll have a thin spring." He nodded as though this confirmed something he already suspected. "My neighbor to the north, a man named Colton Shaw, has been trying to buy the east parcel of my land since last spring. He's offered a fair price. Do you want to sell it?" He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. "No," he said, "but fair prices and want don't always align." She looked at the figures in the ledger. "If you increase the breeding stock by 10 head this winter and sell the steers in the spring before the market softens, you could hold the east parcel and end the year solvent. It would be tight." He looked at her. "You figured that out from those numbers." "My father taught me accounting," she said. He was a thorough man. What was he like? The question surprised her. People in Caldwell had been respectful enough about Clement Shelton's passing, but nobody had actually asked her what he was like, because the dead are a subject that people are generally eager to move past. She looked at Warren Weston and found that the question appeared genuinely motivated. "He was good," she said, and the word was insufficient, but it was also entirely accurate. He was the kind of man who believed that understanding things was the same as respecting them. He read everything he could find. He was not a successful farmer, he had no talent for it, but he understood why he wasn't, which he said was better than being successful through luck and not knowing the difference. Warren smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed the geography of his face considerably, opening it up in a way that made something in her chest do a complicated thing. "He sounds like a man I'd have liked to know," he said. "He would have liked you," she said, and then felt immediately aware of having said it because it was true and also too personal for 3 weeks of acquaintance, and she looked back down at the ledger quickly. He did not press it. He finished his coffee and said good night and went upstairs, and she sat with the ledger and the lamplight and the sound of the wind outside, and she thought about the way that honesty had a way of arriving before you were ready for it. The November cold settled over the ranch like a firm hand. The work became harder in the particular ways that winter work on a cattle ranch becomes harder: water sources that needed breaking, animals that needed extra hay, cold that got into the joints and made every task take longer. Rose discovered that she liked the work. Not in the way of a person who likes a thing because it is familiar, but in the deeper way of a person who finds that physical labor suits them, that the satisfaction of a completed task at the end of a cold day is a real and substantial thing. She rode out with Warren one morning in the second week of November to check the eastern fence line, because one of the hands had reported a gap, and because the two of them had developed, in the past weeks, the comfortable working relationship that develops between people who are competent and trust each other's competence. The ride was long and cold, and the prairie was the pale gold of late autumn, and the sky was a clear, cold blue that felt almost hostile in its perfection. They rode mostly in silence, the way people ride who don't need to fill the silence to be comfortable in it, and Rose found herself thinking that she had not been this easy in anyone's company since her father died. They found the fence gap. Warren dismounted and examined it, and Rose dismounted without being asked and held both horses while he worked. The gap was larger than reported, and it took nearly an hour to repair properly, and by the time they were done, they were cold enough that speaking required effort. On the ride back he said, "Do you miss Caldwell?" "I never liked Caldwell particularly," she said. "I lived there because my father's land was there." "Where would you go after the year?" It was the first time he had asked anything that touched the border of her future, and she considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "West, maybe, California. My father talked about California the way people talk about something they know they'll never reach but enjoy wanting. That's a long way." "Yes." They rode in silence for a while, and then he said, as if the sentence had been sitting at the back of his throat for some time and had finally decided to come out, "I'd prefer it if you stayed." She looked at him. He was looking forward at the horizon, at the place where the ranch house would eventually appear as a dark shape against the tawny grass. "That's not," she started. "I know," he said. "It's not what the contract says, and it's not an appropriate thing to say. I apologize for saying it." He glanced at her then briefly, and there was something in his expression that was both entirely honest and entirely uncertain, and she recognized it because she had felt it herself on several occasions in the past weeks and had been equally unprepared for it. She looked back at the horizon. Her heart was doing something she chose not to examine too closely just yet. "Let's get back before that wind picks up," she said. "Yes," he said. "Let's." The winter settled in properly by December, and with it came a rhythm of evenings that Rose found herself looking forward to with an intensity that was somewhat alarming. After dinner, with the horses seen to and the kitchen cleaned and the ranch accounts updated, they would sit by the sitting-room fire and talk. Sometimes Dutch Ferris joined them for an hour, a dry and observant man who told stories about the trail drives of the early 70s with the unfussy authority of someone relating actual history. Caleb occasionally appeared with questions about the cattle or the horses that were transparently pretexts for the company. But more often it was just the two of them, and the fire, and the conversation that had developed a depth and a range that surprised Rose every time she thought about it. They argued about economics one evening, and about the proper construction of a cattle shed the following one. They talked about the books she had been reading from his shelf, which was fuller and more varied than she had expected, with histories and natural science texts, and a worn copy of Middlemark that she did not ask about but noted with considerable interest. They talked about the Indian nations to the south, and the way the cattle drives were changing the land, and the uncomfortable moral arithmetic of a country that was built on displacement, and which preferred not to dwell on this. And on this subject, she found that he had views that were considerably more honest than most men she had encountered, which she appreciated, even when she disagreed with some of the details. One evening in mid-December, she came into the sitting room to find him at the writing desk, finishing a letter. He folded it quickly when she entered, and she would not have thought anything of it except that his manner the following day had a quality of preoccupation that was new to her, a restlessness, as if he was waiting for something. She did not ask. The letter appeared to be his private business, and she was not the kind of woman who needed to know everything about the person she was. She stopped that thought mid-formation and redirected it firmly toward the fire and the book in her lap. The letter turned out to be relevant, as things often do when you do your best not to think about them. Gerald Holt came out to the ranch on the 20th of December with two of his business associates, men from Wichita, and the look on his face when he rode into the yard was the look of a man arriving with leverage. Rose was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, and she came to the door and saw Holt dismounting with his associates, and something in her chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the December air. She had not seen him since the auction day, and she had managed in the weeks that had passed to stop thinking about him constantly, which had been a considerable achievement. Warren was in the barn. He came out with the unhurried gait of a man who is not surprised by what he finds, and who is not going to let on if he is. He greeted Holt without warmth but with correct politeness, the specific social calibration of a man who knows the rules and applies them exactly and not a degree more. Holt's business was this. He had decided, apparently after considerable reflection, that the terms of the labor contract he had drafted were somehow legally ambiguous. His associates from Wichita were, he claimed, legal experts. The ambiguity, he suggested, was around the question of whether $175 fully cleared the $212 debt, given interest. There was a clause in the original debt agreement, he said, that specified a monthly interest rate, and by his calculation the debt had grown in the time since Clement Shelton's death, and the auction price did not fully cover it, and there was therefore an additional obligation still outstanding. Rose listened to this from the kitchen doorway with the cold, clear comprehension of a woman who understands exactly what is happening. The numbers Holt was presenting were false. She knew they were false because she had reviewed her father's original debt agreement twice, and there was no interest clause. She had read every line of it. Holt was manufacturing a continuation of obligation for his own purposes, which were exactly what they had always been, and the legal associates from Wichita were not, she suspected, lawyers in any formal sense. Warren listened to Holt's presentation with perfect patience and then said, "I received a letter yesterday from Judge Thomas Alcott in Wichita." Holt blinked. It was the blink of a man whose script has been interrupted. "Judge Alcott has reviewed the original debt agreement, the auction contract, and my subsequent payment to your accounts," Warren said. "He has confirmed in writing that the debt is fully cleared and that no further obligation exists. I wrote to him 3 weeks ago when I suspected this conversation might occur." He reached into his coat and produced the letter, unfolded it, and handed it to Holt without comment. Rose stood very still in the doorway. She thought, this is why he was preoccupied. This is what the letter was. Holt read Judge Alcott's letter with the expression of a man eating something that has gone bad. His associates exchanged a look. Holt handed the letter back and he said, with the surface pleasantness that was the most genuinely threatening thing about him, "You're a careful man, Mr. Weston." "I try to be," Warren said. Holt looked at Rose then for the first time since arriving, and the look was the old look, the assessing look, but there was something else in it now, something that was not quite defeat but was the shape defeat makes when it is rearranging itself into patience. "Miss Shelton," he said, "I hope the arrangement is proving satisfactory." "Entirely," she said, and held his gaze without flinching. Holt and his associates left. The horses' hoofbeats faded down the road toward town, and Rose stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment in the cold air, and felt something she recognized eventually as gratitude, and something else she was less practiced at naming. She went inside to the kitchen and began preparing dinner, and Warren came in from seeing the horses to the barn and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and stood by the window, and the kitchen was quiet around them. "You wrote to the judge 3 weeks ago," she said, her back to him, working at the stove. "Yes." Before Holt gave any indication he was going to try something. "I know how men like Holt operate," he said. It seemed prudent. She was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me." He was quiet too for a moment. "I didn't want to worry you until I knew whether it was necessary." She turned around. He was still by the window, and the pale winter light was coming in at his back, and he looked exactly like what he was, a straightforward, decent man standing in his kitchen, and she looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Thank you, Warren." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes and said, simply, "You're welcome, Rose." It was the first time he had used her given name. Christmas came to the Weston ranch with a quietness that Rose found she preferred to the louder celebrations she remembered from town. Mrs. Marsh came out on Christmas Eve with her nephew, a cheerful young man named Edgar, and brought a dried apple cake and enough opinions about the proper preparation of Christmas dinner to keep the kitchen lively for 3 hours. Dutch Ferris produced a fiddle from somewhere and turned out to be a remarkably competent player. Caleb, in a fit of seasonal generosity, had acquired a small spruce tree from somewhere in the river bottom to the east and stood it in the sitting-room corner with the proud expression of a man presenting a significant trophy. Warren had somehow obtained, through means that he did not fully explain, a complete copy of Middlemarch, the George Eliot novel. The one on his shelf was missing its final 60 pages, a condition that Rose had mentioned once, in passing, 6 weeks earlier. He gave it to her on Christmas morning with the slightly awkward presentation of a man who is not accustomed to giving gifts and is uncertain of the reception. She looked at the book in her hands and then looked at him, and felt something unlock in her chest that she recognized immediately as something she was not going to be able to put back. "How did you find it?" she asked. "I wrote to a bookseller in Wichita when I was writing to the judge," he said. "It seemed like the same trip." She laughed. She had not laughed like that, the real laugh, in longer than she could accurately recall. He looked startled by it and then pleased, and then he laughed too, and the sound of it was warm in the cold morning house. She gave him a pair of leather riding gloves she had made from a piece of hide she had bought from the tanner in town, spending 2 weeks on the work in the evenings after he had gone upstairs. They were well-made gloves, carefully stitched, fitted properly for his hands in a way that required knowing the exact dimensions of those hands, which she had measured without his knowledge by tracing his work gloves on paper. He looked at them for a long time without saying anything, and then put them on and flexed his fingers and said, "These are the finest gloves I've ever owned," and his voice had a quality that made her look away toward the window. January came in hard. 3 weeks of cold and wind that kept everyone close to the house, that turned every outdoor task into an exercise in determination, that reduced the world to the small circle of warmth around the stoves and the fire. Rose discovered what it was like to be confined with a person for extended periods, in the particular crucible of hard winter on an open plains ranch, and what she discovered was that the person she was confined with was consistently good company in all the specific ways that matter when there is nowhere else to go. He did not become irritable in the cold, the way many men did. He did not become overly talky in the way that other men did, filling silence with noise to paper over the discomfort of closeness. He was simply himself, steadily and without variation, which is a rarer quality than it sounds. He fixed things when they broke. He checked on the animals with the same thoroughness in the worst weather as in the mild weather. He read in the evenings and shared what he was reading and asked what she thought, and listened when she told him, actually listened, with the specific attention of a man for whom other people's thinking is genuinely interesting. There was an evening in the third week of January when the wind was making the house sound like a ship in difficult water, and both Dutch and Caleb had retreated early to the bunkhouse for warmth, and Rose and Warren were alone in the sitting room with the fire burning hard against the cold. She was reading and he was writing in the ranch journal, and she looked up at some point and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away. "Say it," she said. He set down his pen. "I don't know quite how to say it," he said. "I'm better at practical things." "Then say the practical version." He looked at her steadily. "I would like very much for you to stay here," he said. "Not as an employee, not under any contract. I would like you to stay because this house feels like a house for the first time since I bought it, and because I find that I think about what you're thinking more than I think about most things, and because when I'm near you everything operates at a higher frequency, which is not something I can explain more precisely, and I am aware it sounds like something from a book." She looked at him. The fire made the room golden, and the wind outside was the entire outside world, and there was nothing between them but honest air. "It doesn't sound like something from a book," she said. "It sounds like you." He came to sit beside her on the settee, not touching, still leaving the polite distance that a careful man leaves, and he said, "I know you had California in mind." "California was my father's dream," she said. "I was only borrowing it because I didn't have one of my own yet." He was very still. "And now?" She looked at his hands on his knees, the fine gloves folded on the arm of the settee beside him, and she thought about everything that had happened since an October morning when a man in a town square had looked her in the eyes before he raised his hand, and she thought about what that look had contained and what she had found in it in all the weeks since. "I think I have one now," she said. He reached over very slowly, giving her every opportunity to redirect, and took her hand. His hand was warm and solid and entirely certain, and she turned her palm upward and held his hand back, and they sat like that while the Kansas winter howled outside the windows, and the fire burned, and the world rearranged itself around something new and permanent. He kissed her on a Sunday afternoon in February, on the front porch in a brief break in the cold, when the sun was actually warm enough to stand in for a few minutes. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have already covered the dramatic ground in a dozen conversations and 100 shared mornings, and who are now arriving at the physical expression of something already established. She kissed him back with the particular certainty of a woman who has made a decision and is acting on it completely. "I need to ask you something properly," he said, pulling back. "Warren." "No, properly. I know it's only been 4 months, and I know the circumstances were unconventional from the beginning, and I know—" "Warren," she said again, and she was smiling so fully it was difficult to form the word. "Yes," he said. "Ask me." He looked at her with everything showing on his face, which was new for him and which she found extraordinary. "Rose Shelton," he said, "will you stay, as my wife, as the person this ranch belongs to as much as it belongs to me, as the person I would like to have beside me for as long as there is a beside me?" She looked out at the flat Kansas landscape, the pale winter sky, the tawny grass running to the horizon, the dark shape of the barn, the smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, and everything about it looked exactly like home. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." Spring came the way it always comes on the Kansas prairie, reluctantly and then all at once, the green arriving overnight in a way that always felt like a surprise regardless of how many times you had watched it happen. The grass came back with a richness that was almost violent after the gray weeks of late winter, and the cattle that had endured the cold with their patient, massive stoicism spread out across the pastures with evident gratitude, and the kitchen garden showed its first hopeful shoots in the rose Rose had prepared in the warming earth. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning in April, at the small church in Caldwell that Rose's father had occasionally attended more for the community than for the doctrine. It was a modest ceremony, which suited both of them. Dutch Ferris came in his cleanest shirt with his fiddle for the celebration after. Caleb wore a borrowed tie with the expression of a young man doing his level best to rise to an occasion. Mrs. Elba Marsh sat in the front pew and cried in the specific way of women who are satisfied with how things have turned out and are not embarrassed to show it. The preacher was a young man named Holloway who had only been in Caldwell for 8 months and who performed the ceremony with the slightly uncertain energy of someone still learning the particular rhythms of frontier ministry. His uncertainty made the ceremony feel more genuine, Rose thought, less polished and therefore more honest. Gerald Holt was not in attendance. He had not been invited. Rose had heard, through Mrs. Marsh's reliable network of information, that Holt had recently encountered his own financial difficulties due to a grain speculation that had gone badly, and that the large building his company occupied on the main street was likely to change hands before the end of the year. She found that she had essentially no feelings about this one way or the other, which she thought was probably the healthiest possible response. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Warren turned to her with an expression she was learning to read with increasing fluency, the particular combination of restraint and intensity that was the signature of a man who feels deeply and has always chosen carefully. He kissed her with the full assembly watching, brief and warm and unmistakably certain, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat and thought that this was the exact center of everything. The celebration after the ceremony moved from the church to the yard outside and then back to the Weston ranch, where Dutch's fiddle provided a soundtrack for the afternoon and Mrs. Marsh supervised the food and Caleb danced with a nervous energy that suggested he was hoping someone specific was watching, which turned out to be the preacher's young sister, a girl named Mary who had come along to assist with the reception, and who found Caleb's enthusiasm considerably more appealing than he had any right to expect. The spring brought new work and new possibilities. Rose planted the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that went well beyond domestic necessity, adding medicinal herbs she had learned from Mrs. Marsh, and a larger vegetable section than the ranch had maintained before, and a row of sunflowers along the south side of the house that she put in purely because she liked the way they would look against the stone in late summer. Warren watched the expansion of the garden with the amused respect of a man watching someone claim territory they are entitled to. The cattle operation went as Rose had predicted in the Winter Ledger Review. The 10 additional breeding heads Warren had acquired in late winter, found at a good price from a rancher south of town who was downsizing, made themselves felt in the spring count in a way that improved the season's numbers satisfactorily. The steer sales in early April, before the market softened as the newspaper had suggested it would, provided a margin that kept the East parcel comfortably in Warren's possession and reduced Colton Shaw's purchase inquiries to a silence that sounded like acceptance. She took over the ranch accounts fully and completely, not because Warren could not manage them, but because she was better at it, and because they both knew it and neither of them needed to make a performance out of the fact. The books she kept were models of clarity, with notes in the margins that explained the reasoning behind each decision and projections that extended 3 seasons forward, with a precision that Dutch Ferris regarded with the respectful suspicion of a man who distrusts numbers but recognizes competence. There was a day in early May when a family came through settlers heading west, a husband and wife and 3 children, their wagon badly in need of repair, their water supply low, their faces wearing the particular strain of people who have been on the road longer than their optimism prepared them for. Warren stopped them at the gate and brought them in without any discussion, and Rose fed them, and the children were given the sitting room floor to sleep on, and the couple slept in the spare bedroom. And in the morning Warren helped the man repair the wagon wheel, and Rose packed them enough food for 3 days and refused any payment. When they had gone, Rose stood in the yard and watched the wagon get small in the distance and said, "Have you always done that?" "When I could," he said. "Your mother teach you that?" He was quiet for a moment. "She tried to teach me everything worth knowing," he said. "She died when I was 17, fever, same as your father." She looked at him. "I didn't know that. I don't talk about it often." He watched the wagon until it disappeared over the rise. "She would have liked you," he said. "She liked women with the sense to be themselves regardless of what the world suggested they ought to be." Rose felt the full weight of that compliment settle in her chest, and she took his hand the way she had learned to take it, firmly and without preamble, and they stood together in the May morning while the wagon vanished into the prairie horizon. The summer of 1879 was long and hot, and demanding in all the ways that Kansas summers demand, with the work expanding to fill every available hour of daylight, and then compressing itself into necessary rest after dark. Dutch Ferris, who had reached an age where he felt entitled to strong opinions, declared on multiple occasions that the ranch had never run better, which from a man of his habitual taciturnity amounted to something very close to enthusiasm. Caleb had, somewhat to everyone's surprise, begun courting Mary Holloway with a seriousness that had transformed his general energy from boyish eagerness to something more focused and considered. He worked harder. He was more careful. He had written 3 letters, laboriously composed at the bunkhouse table with Dutch's barely concealed observations, providing an unasked-for editorial voice. Rose helped him with the 4th letter, sitting at the kitchen table and suggesting replacements for phrases that would have benefited from revision, and Caleb had received a favorable response and had been so pleased with himself that he had barely been possible to be around for a week. Warren watched Caleb's transformation with an expression that Rose recognized as the expression he wore when something confirmed a view he had held for some time. "He's a good hand," he told her one evening. "He'll be a better one now." "Because of Mary. Because of having someone to be better for," he said. She looked at him across the dinner table in the warm lamplight of a summer evening with the window open and the smell of the grass coming in and said, "Is that how it works for men?" He met her look with the directness that was one of his fundamental qualities. "I think that's how it works for everyone," he said. "Only some people find the person." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and his fingers turned and caught hers, and outside the Kansas summer evening stretched wide and gold and endless. In August she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen in the morning before anyone else was up, when the sky was just beginning to lighten and the house was still and cool. She said it plainly, because she was a plain-spoken woman, and because he was a man who deserved plain speaking. He stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen floor and took both her hands and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something that was simultaneously amazement and terror, and a joy so large it appeared to have no ceiling. He said her name, just her name, Rose, and his voice was the voice of a man completely undone by good news. She laughed and pressed her forehead to his chest and felt him exhale slowly, and his arms came around her and held her with the specific gentleness of a man in the presence of something he understands to be extraordinary. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said. "Completely and entirely." "Good," she said. "Then we're even." Mrs. Marsh, when informed, produced an opinion about virtually every aspect of the matter, from diet to rest to the proper construction of a cradle, and embarked on what amounted to a second career as an advisor to the Weston household that Rose found simultaneously excessive and genuinely comforting. Dutch Ferris received the news with a long silence and a slow nod and then said, "Good. This place needs children in it." And that was the full extent of his commentary, which was also somehow perfectly sufficient. The fall of 1879 was warm, which was a kindness, and the ranch work had the particular satisfaction of a year wrapping up well. The cattle count was strong. The winter stores were more than adequate. The kitchen garden had produced beyond its best previous season, and the sunflowers along the south wall had turned their great heads toward the sun all summer, and now stood dry and golden and full of seeds that Rose had harvested carefully and stored for the following year. On a clear October evening, with the anniversary of the auction not quite reached but close enough to feel, Rose walked out to the front porch and stood in the dark that was full of stars and thought about all the things that had led from that platform in the Caldwell town square to this porch on this ranch under this sky. She thought about fear and about the particular courage required to look someone in the eyes in a moment of transaction and see a person instead of an object. She thought about what it meant to be seen. She heard the door behind her and felt Warren's presence before he spoke, which was a thing she had developed over the past year, a physical awareness of where he was that she found it impossible to explain to anyone else and did not particularly try to. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Thinking," she said. He came to stand beside her and his shoulder was warm against hers and they looked at the enormous Kansas sky together. "Do you remember the auction?" she asked. "Yes." "You looked at me," she said. "Before you raised your hand. Everyone else was looking at the auctioneer or at the ground or at each other, doing the calculations, and you just looked directly at me. I remember." "Why?" she asked. "I asked you that day, and you said because it seemed like the right thing to do, but that's not a complete answer." He was quiet for a moment. The prairie wind moved in the grass, and somewhere a night bird called once and went quiet. "Because you looked terrified," he said, "and brave at the same time. You were standing up there on that platform in front of all those men, and you were holding yourself like someone who refuses to be less than herself regardless of the circumstances. And I wanted you to know that I could see that. I wanted you to know that whoever raised their hand for you, at least this one person in that square was seeing you as you actually were." Rose stood very still and felt the full weight of that land on her exactly as it had landed originally, on that platform in October of 1878, when 4 seconds of eye contact had contained more genuine acknowledgement than she had received from most of the world in her 24 years. "I never forgot it," she said. "I know," he said. "I hoped you wouldn't." She turned to him in the dark and he was looking at her with the same look, the same straight, honest, unhurried look that had started everything, and she put her hand on his face and said, "I love you, Warren Weston." He covered her hand with his. "I love you, Rose Weston," he said. "I have since that morning, I think, or close enough to that morning that the difference doesn't matter." She kissed him on the porch under the October stars while the wind moved through the grass, and he held her with careful arms that were also strong arms, which was a combination she had discovered was rarer than anyone admitted, and the night was enormous around them and also entirely contained. Their son was born in the late winter, in February of 1880, during a snow that was gentle enough not to impede the arrival of Mrs. Marsh, who had appointed herself the presiding authority on the matter, and arrived at the ranch 2 days before the birth with enough supplies and opinions to see the enterprise through. Mrs. Marsh proved invaluable, as she tended to prove invaluable in most situations where she had decided her skills were required. They named him James Clement Weston. James for Warren's father, who had been a good man by all accounts, and Clement for Rose's father, who had been a good man by her direct and unassailable knowledge. The two names together felt like an acknowledgment of the people who had made the two of them what they were, which seemed right and necessary. James Clement Weston was born with a quantity of dark hair that Mrs. Marsh declared remarkable, and that Dutch Ferris observed, with his characteristic economy, looked promising. Caleb, who had by this point formally proposed to Mary Holloway, and received an acceptance that produced several days of the kind of joy that is physically visible on a person, held the baby with the terrified reverence of a young man confronting something both small and enormous, and said that the baby had a look of great determination about him. Warren held his son for the first time in the hours after the birth, sitting by the window with the winter light coming in pale and clear, and Rose watched him from the bed, exhausted and more awake than she had ever been, and saw on his face the same expression he had worn when she told him she was pregnant, the same bottomless amazement, the same terrible and wonderful seriousness of a man receiving something he understands he is not prepared for and intends to rise to regardless. He looked up from the baby and found her watching him and said, "He looks like you. He looks like himself," she said. "That too," he said. "He looks like himself and like you, and those are good things to look like." She smiled with the last of her available energy and closed her eyes, and the baby made a small sound that was not quite a complaint and not quite a question, and outside the snow fell quietly on the ranch. Spring came again with its reliable extravagance, and the ranch came back to life around the baby, who was growing with the alarming speed of a healthy child, and who had, by the time he was 3 months old, attached himself with particular affection to Dutch Ferris, who was not remotely prepared for this development but who was observed, on multiple occasions, sitting on the porch with the baby against his shoulder with an expression that could only be described as profoundly contented. Dutch had, it emerged, been married once, a long time ago, to a woman in Texas, and she had died of cholera in 1864, and there had been no children, and he had been on the trail and on the range ever since, not as a man running from something but as a man who had found no particular reason to stay in one place. He said none of this directly. He said it in the oblique way of men who talk around the things that matter, and Rose pieced it together over several conversations and understood it and said nothing and simply made sure that he felt, whenever he was in the ranch house, entirely at home. Warren noticed. He noticed most things. One evening he said to her quietly, "You knew about Dutch." "I guessed," she said. "Most people wouldn't have thought to be kind to him about it." "Most people don't look carefully enough," she said, and he looked at her with the look she recognized as the highest possible form of his appreciation, which was still and full and entirely without performance. Caleb and Mary Holloway were married in June of 1880, at the same small church where Rose and Warren had married 14 months earlier. The ceremony was performed by Mary's brother, the same young Reverend Holloway who had become more comfortable in his role, and who conducted the service with a warmth that the earlier months had not yet allowed him. Rose sat beside Warren in the third pew with James Clement sleeping in her arms, and she watched two young people make promises with the particular sincerity of those who have not yet learned what promises cost, which she found genuinely moving because that sincerity was its own kind of bravery. Caleb and Mary would go on, in the months after their wedding, to establish a small spread of their own 5 miles north of the Weston ranch, on a parcel that Warren helped Caleb identify, and whose purchase Warren assisted with a loan that he framed as a straightforward business arrangement, and which Caleb accepted with the dignity of a young man learning what generosity looks like when it is done without fanfare. The summer of 1880 brought a drought that was not catastrophic, but was serious. The grass went thin, and the creek that ran through the eastern corner of the ranch dropped low in its banks, and the cattle needed constant management to keep them finding sufficient water. Warren and Dutch and the new hand he had hired, a quiet, capable man from New Mexico named Ramos Delgado, worked from before sunrise to after sunset through the worst weeks, and Rose kept the house and the baby and the records, and also rode out twice a week to carry water and food to the men in the field, which was not in any job description, but which was simply what the situation required. On one of these rides, in the second week of the drought, she came across Colton Shaw's property at the eastern boundary. Shaw's cattle were in noticeably worse condition than Warren's, which told her that Shaw had not been as careful with his water management, and Shaw himself was in the field looking at his animals with the expression of a man counting losses. She stopped her horse and said good afternoon, and asked if he had enough water on his property. He looked at her with some surprise and some suspicion, which was understandable given that his history with the Weston ranch involved his failed attempts to acquire land from it. She waited. Shaw was a proud man, but he was also a man with an acute awareness of practical necessity, and the drought had apparently loosened something in the competition between them. He admitted the water on his property was inadequate. She told him that the spring on the northwest corner of the Weston land was currently running well above what they needed, and that if his cattle were walked along the boundary road, they would be welcome to water there. She said she would tell Warren when she got back, but that she was confident he would agree. Warren did agree, without hesitation, when she told him that evening. The following day he rode over to Shaw's boundary himself and had a conversation with the man that lasted nearly 2 hours, and which resulted in a handshake and an arrangement that involved shared access to the spring water for the duration of the drought, and an end to the land purchase inquiries that both of them apparently found it a relief to set aside. "You started that," Warren said to her when he came home. "I only opened a door," she said. "You walked through it." "We did," he said, and his tone closed the distinction in a way that settled something permanently between them. The drought broke in late August with 3 days of rain that came in from the southwest, with the enormous authority of the Kansas sky asserting its real nature. And the grass came back, and the creek filled, and the cattle found their weight again, and the ranch moved into fall with the specific satisfaction of having endured something and come through it intact. By the autumn of 1880, 2 years from the morning of the auction, the Weston Ranch was the operation that Warren had always intended it to be. The herd was healthy and properly sized. The land was in good order. The house had been expanded by a room on the north side, which had been Warren's project through the spring, and which Rose had suspected was not entirely about the additional space, but also about the particular satisfaction of building something with your own hands onto something you already love. James Clement, approaching his first birthday, had moved from sleeping to exploring with the alarming speed of a healthy boy who found the world comprehensively interesting. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's determined jaw and Dutch Ferris's inexplicable affection, and he treated the ranch house as a landscape requiring thorough investigation, pulling himself along the floor with a focused energy that made everyone within range slightly nervous about the proximity of interesting objects. Rose sat on the porch one afternoon in late October, with James Clement in her lap, watching Warren work on the fence that bordered the south pasture. He was unhurried and precise in everything he did. This man she had married, and she watched his hands on the fence wire and his back in his work coat, and the way he occasionally stood back to evaluate what he had done. And she thought about something Mrs. Marsh had said to her recently, when Rose had confided that she sometimes could not quite believe the turn her life had taken from that morning on the platform to this afternoon on this porch. Mrs. Marsh had said, with the authority of a woman who has lived enough life to have perspective on it, "Sometimes the best things that happen to us come dressed as the worst things. You just have to keep your eyes open long enough to see what something actually is." Rose looked at the porch boards and then at the prairie and then at her son, who was watching a beetle navigate the porch railing with the complete absorption of a person for whom the beetle is the most important thing in the world. She kissed the top of his head, and he smelled of warmth and milk and the particular sweetness of small children that you understand, when you are in the presence of it, is not something that lasts and must therefore be registered fully while it is available. Warren finished the fence section and walked back toward the house, dusting his gloves against each other. He saw her on the porch and changed his angle toward her rather than toward the barn, and she watched him come. He was 30 years old now, and the years of ranch work were in his hands and his shoulders, and the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, and he was exactly himself, which was the person she had seen in his face on a platform in a dusty town square 2 years ago, when he had looked at her before he raised his hand and showed her, in 4 seconds, what a person could be. He climbed the porch steps and sat down beside her, and James Clement reached immediately for his father's gloves, which was his reliable response to his father's appearance. "The south fence is done," Warren said. "I know," she said. "I watched you." He glanced at her with the small private smile that was his. "How long were you watching?" "Long enough," she said. He took the baby and held him up, and James Clement produced the laugh that was his best feature, a completely joyful sound that made both his parents smile the way only a child's laugh can make a person smile, with something that bypasses all defense and goes directly to the core. Warren held him against his chest, and the baby grabbed his ear, and Warren suffered this with perfect equanimity. "Rose," he said. "Warren," she answered in the same tone. "I want to say something." "Say it." He looked at her over their son's dark head, in the October afternoon light that fell on the Weston ranch porch the same way it fell on everything in Kansas, without favoritism, equally and generously. "I'm the most fortunate man I know," he said. "I say that not to be sentimental, but because it is the plainest accurate statement I can make about the situation I am in, and you know I prefer plain accuracy." She leaned against his shoulder. "I know you do," she said. "It's one of my favorite things about you." They sat on the porch while the afternoon progressed toward evening, and the light went golden and then amber, and then the particular soft rose of a Kansas sunset that turns the grass and the sky and everything in between into something you could spend a lifetime trying to describe and still not get exactly right. The baby fell asleep between them, a warm and considerable weight, breathing with the settled conviction of someone who has never had reason to doubt the world is safe. Dutch came out of the barn and looked toward the porch and saw the three of them there, and turned back into the barn without comment. But Rose saw the look on his face in the moment before he turned, and it was the face of a man who is genuinely glad for the existence of good things, which she thought was worth more than most more demonstrative expressions. She would think later about the way a single act of ordinary decency, a man choosing to look at a woman as a person before he chose to help her, could propagate through years and change the shape of more than two lives. She would think about it when James Clement was old enough to understand stories, and she told him the one about the auction, not to frighten him or to instruct him, but simply because it was where everything began, and beginnings matter. She would tell him that his father had been the only man in a crowded square who had looked at her with honest eyes, and that she had never forgotten it, and that from that one moment of plain human decency, the whole architecture of their lives had followed. She would tell him that the lesson was not complicated. You look at people, you see them as they are. You raise your hand when raising your hand is the right thing to do. The rest, if you are fortunate, arranges itself. James Clement, in later years, would report that his mother told this story with a particular stillness, a quality of attention as if she were watching the whole thing play out again in the space in front of her, and that his father, whenever she told it, would be looking at her with the expression of a man who has been given something extraordinary and knows it and has never stopped knowing it. But that was later. On this particular October evening, the story was still being written, and the porch held the three of them, and the sun went down over the flat Kansas horizon in a great spreading of color, and the stars came out the way they always came out in that country, all at once and with complete commitment, and Warren put his arm around Rose and she settled against him, and the baby slept between them, and the ranch was quiet and the grass was silver in the moonlight, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. Winter came again, the third winter of the Weston ranch as Rose had known it, and she moved through it with the competence and pleasure of someone occupying a life that fits them exactly. She baked bread in the mornings when the house was cold, and the smell of it made the cold irrelevant. She kept the accounts with a precision that now extended to projections and plans for expansion that she and Warren discussed across the kitchen table with the productive energy of two people who respect each other's thinking, and who have found that combining their particular intelligences produces something better than either one alone. She corresponded with Mrs. Marsh regularly through the winter, long letters that covered the baby's development and the ranch operations, and the books she was reading, and the occasional large question of how to live that arises in the long, quiet hours of cold, dark evenings, and which requires someone of Mrs. Marsh's experience and directness to address. Mrs. Marsh's letters back were equally long and considerably more opinionated and frequently funny, which Rose had known would be true before the correspondence began. She wrote once to the preacher's wife in Caldwell, a woman she had come to know through Caleb and Mary's wedding, to ask about whether the town had any organized effort to address the situation of women arriving in Caldwell without resources or family connections, which was a common occurrence in a cattle town on the Kisham Trail, and which seemed to Rose to require more systematic attention than it was currently receiving. The response indicated that no such organized effort existed, and Rose filed this information in the part of her mind where she kept things that would eventually require action. In the spring of 1881, Rose organized the first meeting of what would eventually become a small but functional women's aid society in Caldwell, meeting monthly in the church hall to address the particular difficulties of women new to the town or in financial distress. It was not a grand institution. It was 4 women initially, including Mrs. Marsh and Mary Holloway and the preacher's wife, meeting with the specific practical focus of people who want to solve problems rather than discuss them. Within 2 years, it would have 12 members and a small fund, and a network of connections that could find work or accommodation for a woman in difficulty with reasonable efficiency. Warren supported this endeavor without qualification and without the particular patronizing support that sometimes passes for support and is actually control. He provided the initial fund contribution, made the wagon available on meeting days without being asked, and said, when she first described her intentions, "Tell me what you need," which was exactly and completely the right thing to say. She looked at him then with everything she felt plainly visible in her face, which was something she had learned from him, how to let what you feel show without apology, and said, "I need you to keep being exactly who you are." "That I can manage," he said. James Clement, watching his parents from the floor where he was engaged in the complex structural engineering of stacking wooden blocks, looked up at this exchange with the alert attention of a small child taking in more than adults generally assume, and then returned to his blocks with the satisfied focus of someone who has confirmed what he already suspected. The ranch expanded the following spring, in 1882, not by land but by operation, with a modest horse breeding program that Warren had been considering for 2 years, and which Rose had run the numbers on and found viable. The first mares arrived in April, 5 of them from a reputable breeder in Missouri, and they were good animals with the broad chests and steady temperaments of horses bred for endurance rather than speed. Ramos Delgado, who had stayed on through the drought and the seasons since, and who turned out to have a natural and exceptional talent with horses that went well beyond his cattle skills, became the central hand for the horse operation, and took to the responsibility with a quiet pride that was visible in every aspect of how he handled the animals. The ranch had a settled quality now that it had been building toward since Rose first arrived. It was the quality of a place that knows what it is and does it well, where the work has found its proper shape, and the people doing it are the right people. Dutch Farris, who had been with Warren since the beginning of the ranch, was 60 years old in 1882 and doing the work of a man of 50 and showing no particular intention of doing otherwise. He had developed over the years a relationship with James Clement that was one of the most purely wholesome things Rose had ever observed. The old trail hand and the small boy walking through the horse pasture in the early morning, Dutch explaining things with a patience and a care he apparently reserved specifically for this one audience, and James Clement absorbing everything with the focused attention of a child, in the presence of someone who speaks to them, as if what they understand matters. On a morning in early May of 1882, Rose came to Warren with news that had become familiar in its form if not in its impact. She was pregnant again. He received the news with the same quality of complete response that he had brought to the first time, and she thought that she had perhaps married the only man in Kansas, or possibly in the entire Western Territory, who was as fully present for these moments as the moments deserved. "When?" he asked. "November, I think. The cattle drive will be finished by then," he said, and then caught her expression and said, "That was a practical observation, not a priority statement." She laughed. "I know," she said. "I know exactly which one it was. That's one of my favorite things about you." He shook his head with the specific expression he wore when she turned his own words back at him. "Is it?" "You are consistently and entirely yourself," she said. "Do you have any idea how unusual that is?" He looked at her with the directness she had loved from the first moment she understood what it meant. "No," he said. "I've been too occupied with you to keep track of what other men are." She kissed him in the kitchen in the morning light. This man who had looked at her with honest eyes on a platform in a dusty town square, who had paid $37 more than he needed to pay because the men who were bidding before him had the wrong look about them, who had written to a judge in Wichita 3 weeks before Gerald Holt arrived on his doorstep because he anticipated trouble and wanted her protected from it before she knew it was coming, who had given her gloves and a book and a year and then a lifetime, who had built a room onto his house and kept the East Parcel and started a horse program and lent Caleb money without fanfare and offered water to Colton Shaw during the drought and held their son up in the October light, and said, "I am the most fortunate man I know," without a single degree of exaggeration. She kissed this man, and he kissed her back with the warmth and certainty that was his particular signature. And James Clement came running into the kitchen from the sitting room at high speed and attached himself to both their legs simultaneously, which was a maneuver he had been perfecting. And Warren lifted him up without breaking the moment entirely, and the three of them stood in the morning kitchen, with the spring light coming through the window, and the smell of coffee, and the horses moving in the pasture outside, and the whole long day opening ahead of them. Their daughter was born in November, on a cold, clear day when the sky was so blue it looked impossible, and they named her Clara Louise. She had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark hair and Dutch Ferris's immediate devotion, which nobody was surprised by, and James Clement greeted her with the solemn interest of a 3-year-old considering a development that he had been told to anticipate, but which was considerably more actual than he had apparently been prepared for. Clara Louise Weston made her presence felt with considerable enthusiasm from her first hours, which suggested she had inherited both her mother's will and her father's capacity for certainty, and which Rose observed with the quiet satisfaction of a woman recognizing qualities she intends to cultivate. On the evening of Clara Louise's arrival, after the household had settled, and the baby was sleeping, and James Clement had been persuaded to sleep, and Mrs. Marsh had finally gone home with the satisfied air of someone who has accomplished something important, Warren sat on the edge of the bed where Rose was resting and held her hand in both of his and said nothing for a long while, and the room was quiet and the lamplight was warm, and outside the November stars were out in force over the Kansas prairie. "Are you all right?" he asked eventually. "More than all right," she said. "Are you?" "I keep thinking," he said slowly, "about that morning, October. The auction platform and the distance from that morning to this one." She turned her hand in his. "I know," she said. "I think about it too." "I almost didn't go," he said. "I was in town for supplies and Dutch mentioned the auction and I went on an impulse and almost turned back twice." She looked at him. She had not known this. "What made you stay?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "Only that it seemed like the kind of thing a person ought to see through to the end once they'd started." She squeezed his hand. "I'm glad you're the kind of person who sees things through," she said. "So am I," he said quietly. and brought her hand to his lips and pressed them against her knuckles in the gesture that was entirely his, that she had come to know as his particular and private language of feeling. And she closed her eyes and let herself be entirely in the moment, in the lamplight, in the warmth, in the life they had built from a look and a raised hand and everything that had followed. The Weston ranch would go on. It would go on through good years and dry years and years of low cattle prices and years of high ones. It would go on through the changing decades of a country that was still deciding what it was, still working through the complicated inheritance of its own history, with the fitful progress that is the best that justice can usually manage. Dutch Ferris would stay until he was 70 and retire to a small house in Caldwell, where he could be found most afternoons on his porch in the company of a cat he had acquired, and to whom he spoke with the same patient directness that he had always applied to the most important conversations. Ramos Delgado would eventually own a horse operation of his own, with Warren's reference and Rose's help with the business plan, and would build it into one of the better breeding programs in the county. Caleb and Mary would have 4 children and a prosperous small ranch, and the specific happiness of people who found each other young enough to grow up together. And James Clement Weston would grow up knowing the story of the auction. He would know it the way you know the story that starts everything, the way you know the story that explains, in fundamental terms, what the people who made you were made of. He would know that his father had been the only man in the square who looked his mother in the eyes before raising his hand, and he would carry that story the way his parents had carried it, as evidence of what was possible when a person chose decency over calculation, in a moment when calculation would have been easier. On the front porch of the stone house on an autumn evening in 1885, 7 years after an October morning in Caldwell, Rose Weston sat with her husband and watched their children move through the yard in the long golden light. James Clement, 6 years old and purposeful, was conducting some complex investigation at the fence post. Clara Louise, 3 years old and entirely confident in all her opinions, was explaining something to a very patient ranch cat with the authority of a small person who has never been given reason to doubt that they will be listened to. Rose looked at all of it, the yard and the children and the land running out to the horizon, and the sky that was beginning to streak with the colors of evening, and she felt the specific fullness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from being exactly where you are supposed to be in the company of exactly the right people. Warren's hand found hers on the arm of her chair, and she turned to look at him, and he was looking at her, the same look, the first look, the look that had been the whole beginning, steady and direct and entirely present. And she thought about how a single moment of being seen, truly seen, can become the foundation on which everything else stands. She pressed his hand and he pressed hers back, and the children moved in the golden yard, and the ranch was quiet and full, and the evening came down over the Kansas prairie like a benediction, wide and warm and without end.